In parts of the world, children go to schools made of mud. They have to walk very long distances just to get to school. When they get there, they find they may not have desks or chairs, textbooks, toilets, or even teachers. This situation is compounded for the most disadvantaged children, children from racial and ethnic minorities, children with disabilities, children living in poverty, and girl children. With the increase of private actors, there are concerns that education is putting profits before quality. Now we're going to hear more about specific challenges facing students in the pursuit of their education.
One of the barriers to access to the right to education in South Africa is that a lot of students have to travel very long distances to and from school every day. This means that a lot of students aren't able to go to school if the weather is bad, or that they don't go to school at all. It also means that a lot of students who do walk this long route to school are faced with lots of challenges, so like hijackings, sort of just violence on the way. And women, specifically young girls, face possibilities of sexual assault when they are walking these long distances. It also limits the amount of time they spend at school because they arrive late, and they also have to leave early so that they can arrive home before it gets dark to be able to do homework and also household chores. This is a great impediment to sort of access to the right to education in South Africa.
Well, the right to free and compulsory education has been enshrined as a constitutional right, and we also have a legislation that operationalizes the right, which is called the Right to Education Act in India. But despite these constitutional and legislative frameworks being in existence, there are still a lot of challenges that students face in operationalizing and accessing the right to education. So, for instance, there are a number of infrastructure problems. Even if there is a school, the school may be too far away from where they live, and there may not be transport facilities to get them to school. Within schools, they may not have access to, say, proper toilets, which would impede women from attending schools, especially women who are above the age of puberty. Within schools, the teachers may not be being paid enough and may have no motivation to actually teach students. Teachers may be absent a lot of times. And there are also other social problems that exist in India, for instance, the caste system that impedes students' access to education. So, for example, even if there is one school in the village, the Dalit students, who are students from the lower caste, may not be allowed into the classroom or may be made to sit at the end of the classroom, which would impede their access to effective education. Other problems include not having educational textbooks in your own language. Now, for instance, in the central part of India, there are a lot of Adivasi or indigenous people, and they don't have a written language. They speak their own local languages, and the textbooks are in the state language or in a national language like in the English or Hindi, and the students won't be able to access these textbooks because they don't speak those languages. So these are some of the problems that students in India face in actualizing their right to education.
So the right to education is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's the basis of where we come from. If we break it down, people have other covenants like the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and then other treaties. So if then we come into the national context, there's standards, right? The soft standards of affordability, acceptability, accessibility, and adaptability. Now, let's talk about a child, depending on where they are. If it's a child who comes from a low-income area, an urban informal settlement, the major question they have is, can they actually access learning you know, as a right? Is it accessible to them? Do they have enough schools? Do they have to go far to find the schools that they require? When they get to these schools, do the schools have the right learning standards, but also the right health standards? At the end of the day, can they be able to sit a final exam and actually do well and get good results, but also leave with things that they've learned about citizenship, social cohesion, and so forth, the values that have been set up? So obviously the challenge for them is, if a public school is overcrowded, teachers are always on strike. The teachers don't turn up in class, because this is a major problem across many African countries, that teacher absenteeism is really prevalent. So what do in these circumstances? They don't have enough textbooks. There are 100 learners in a classroom space for 30 learners, you know. And then, so now here they are. So what do the parents think? Let me move them to a low-fee private school. In the low-fee private school, they still have corrugated iron sheets. It's cold, there are no windows. The teachers are untrained, never went to school, so they'll obviously teach off the top of their heads. And it's always the comment that you get, we're just trying, you know, we're just filling the gap. So it's not so much about giving them the best, but we're just trying. And so at the end of the day, the child is 18, 17, got a raw deal from the very onset because the government failed them. And even the people who came to salvage the situation also just offered them raw products and told them, you know what, at the end of the day, live with it. That's the best that you could get. So really, is there a right to education for such a learner? There really isn't for them. For them, they just take what they get.
One of the big challenges facing the education system in South Africa is the prevalence of what we call mud schools, or inappropriate classroom structures. These are structures that have been built out of wood, mud, corrugated iron, and any other materials that local communities have been able to use to build classroom structures. Many of these buildings are very unsafe, dangerously unstable, and endanger the lives of children studying in those schools. This problem of mud schools is the result of a deliberate strategy during apartheid not to invest in education for black learners. So in many ways, the mud schools, which are so prevalent all over the country, are very much a visual reminder of the structural inequality that persists in the education system. And this is a problem because our Constitution guarantees the right to education, which includes the right to study in an environment that is safe and conducive to learning. And this is a long-term challenge for us to improve the classroom structures so that all kids can study in a safe environment.
So Namibia is one of the countries that have entrenched the right to education in its constitution, but since 1990, there has been little happening in terms of asserting the state's obligation in enforcing the right. One of the challenges that comes to mind is that learners in Namibia are frequently faced with closure of schools as a result of floods that occur in the rainy season. Now this results in the closure of schools for 2 to 4 months every year. Sometimes biannually, and this really disrupts the educational outcomes of learners. And yet no long-term solutions have been found to ensure that this disruption is not a constant occurrence, because the consequences are certainly pernicious. On the other hand, there's also the consequence of droughts that cause schools to close down, because many schools, particularly those in remote areas, rely on boreholes, for example. These boreholes are often left unattended to, unrepaired by the state, resulting in the closure of the school because there is no water, and the distances to the school are quite significant. And the assertion of the right to education really interlocks with other rights this demonstrates to us, such as the right to water, the right to sanitation, and so forth.
And then also there's the social environment. We find, for example, in Kenya, the North Rift of the country is very, there are lots of conflicts and cattle rustlings, and it disrupts a lot of the schooling and teaching. So you find that many of the students are absent in schools, but then this is not taken into consideration by the National Education Council, because for them, since it's not proximate to them, they don't understand or do not take into account the hardships that learners in these marginalized areas go through. And also, you're talking about accessibility, and with accessibility, there's also the challenge of food as well, because you find that kids study maybe 4 kilometers from where they live, and once they reach school, they're very hungry. And if a student is really hungry, they won't be able to study well, because they'll be thinking of how hungry they are rather than studying. So there are also these these environments and social factors that affect learners as well.
One of the biggest problems that we found that school children in South Africa experience is the issue of school furniture. For many of us, for me included, it's very difficult to imagine going to school and learning without basic school furniture, without somewhere to sit and somewhere to write. But that's exactly the situation for many school children in rural South Africa, especially in the Eastern Cape. Children find themselves having to sit on a brick or even on the ground in the classroom. And because they don't have a desk, teachers don't give them written exercises in class. Instead, the teachers find that they have to confine all of the learning to speaking, to oral exercises. And that has an obvious impact on educational outcomes.
This is where education can have the biggest impact. And when we limit access to education for the most impoverished, we limit the possibility of them being able to lift themselves out of that state of poverty.